On the 9th of March, in a loan office that smelled of burnt coffee and toner, a man slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and told a 24-year-old woman she had inherited a corpse with a debt attached. He did not use those words. He was a careful man, and careful men choose softer ones. He said the operation was insolvent on paper, that the ground had been farmed past its margin, and that the kindest thing she could do for herself and for the memory of her late father was to let the institution take it back clean before the interest ate what little was left. He called her young lady twice. Both times she heard it land for exactly what it was. She did not argue. She had not come to argue. She had come to read the note, line by line, the way her father had taught her to read anything that asked for her signature. And she read it that way now, while the man watched her with the patient look of someone who has already won and is only waiting for the other person to catch up. $600,000 against 1,400 acres of river bottom and upland ground outside the town of Stella, Nebraska. A balloon payment due in 26 months, an interest rate that climbed if she missed a single quarter. She set the paper down, squared its edge to the edge of the desk, and asked him one question. He answered it wrong, and that was the moment the next 2 years began. Though neither of them knew it yet, let me tell you about Romy Bauer, because everything that came after rests on who she was before that morning. She was known for 2 things in Stella, and both of them got her underestimated. She was patient, past the point most people would call stubborn, and she could read grass, not poetry about grass. She could walk a pasture in April and tell you within a few hundred pounds how much forage stood on an acre, how many days a cow could graze it before it needed rest, and whether the stand was getting stronger or quietly dying under its own thatch. She had learned it from an old man named Emmett Rausch, who had worked her father's ground for 30 years, and she had learned it the way you learn a language, as a child, without noticing you were learning it at all. Her father, Walt, had not been a grass man. He had been a corn man, which in that part of Nebraska meant a man who believed the answer to every bad year was a better hybrid, a bigger planter, and one more passive fertilizer. He was not a foolish man. He was a sincere one, and his sincerity is what put the note on the ground. For 30 years he had done exactly what the system told a good farmer to do. He had tiled the wet ground to drain it, leveled the rolling ground to run a center pivot across it, planted the same 2 crops in the same rotation year after year, and borrowed against next year's bushels to pay for this year's inputs. The system measured him by his yield per acre, and by that measure he was a good farmer right up until the morning his heart stopped in the cab of a tractor in the north field, with the planter half loaded behind him and the seed bill not yet paid. What the system did not measure was the ground itself. The soil under those 1,400 acres had been mined of its life, 1 bushel at a time. The river bottom, that should have been the richest ground in the township, ran together like wet cement after a rain and cracked like a dry lake bed in August. The upland had thinned to the point where a hard storm carried it downhill in brown sheets. None of that showed up on a yield map as anything but a number trending the wrong way, and a number trending the wrong way is easy to blame on weather, or markets, or luck. Walt had blamed all 3. He had died believing he had farmed honestly and been cheated by forces beyond his control, and in a narrow way he was right, and in the way that mattered he was wrong. The man across the desk was named Gil Ostrander, and I want to be fair to him because the story does not work if he is a villain. He was a senior officer at the lending cooperative that held the note, 51 years old, 26 years in agricultural credit, And he had never once in his career been wrong about a farm in a way that hurt him. He believed in the spreadsheet the way other men believe in Scripture, and he had reason to. The spreadsheet had been right about 100 operations before this one. It told him that 1,400 acres of depleted ground, carrying $600,000 of debt in the hands of a 24-year-old with no degree and no off-farm income, was a liquidation waiting to happen. The arithmetic was clean. The only thing the arithmetic could not see was the grass, and the grass was the whole of it. The question Romy asked him that morning was simple. She asked whether the cooperative cared how the note got paid, or only that it got paid. Ostrander smiled the patient smile and told her the institution cared a great deal about how that responsible lending meant a credible plan, that he would need to see projections, cash flow statements, a realistic cropping budget at current commodity prices. She let him finish. She told him she did not intend to plant a single acre of corn. He stopped smiling, not out of cruelty, but out of the genuine bafflement of a man watching someone reach for the one tool he was certain would not work. He said gently that he did not see how she meant to service $600,000 off pasture. She told him she did not expect him to see it yet. Then she folded the note in thirds, put it in her coat, and walked out into a wind that still had winter in it. Consider what she did first, because it was the opposite of dramatic. She did nothing to the ground for almost 2 months. She walked it. She walked all 1,400 acres in widening loops, with Emmett beside her when his knees allowed and alone when they did not, and she carried a notebook and a soil probe and a coffee can with both ends cut out. The coffee can was the cheapest tool on the place, and it taught her the most. She would press it an inch into the ground, fill it with water from a jug, and time how long the water took to soak away. On the worst of the river bottom, where her father had run corn the longest, the water sat on top for over an hour, beating like rain on a waxed hood. Healthy ground drinks an inch of water in minutes. Her ground could not breathe. It had been compacted and stripped until it had forgotten how to be soil at all, and that, she understood, was not a curse. It was a diagnosis, and a diagnosis is a thing you can act on. Here is the mechanism told plainly, because the niche of this story is that the method is real, and you can hold it in your hand. Soil is not dirt. It is a living thing, mostly by weight, a structure of old roots and fungal threads, and the slow work of billions of creatures too small to see, and that living structure is what lets water in and holds it like a sponge and feeds a plant through a dry spell. Tillage and bare ground and a single crop grown over and over starve that structure until it collapses, and a collapsed soil cannot hold water or grow much without being fed from a bag every year, which is exactly the treadmill her father had died running on. You rebuild that structure one way that has ever reliably worked. You keep something green and growing on the ground. As many days of the year as you can, you keep living roots in the soil to feed the life below, and you let animals do the work tractors cannot, by grazing a piece hard for a single day and then leaving it alone for 60. Grass grazed that way grows back deeper rooted and stronger every cycle. The animals trample what they do not eat into a mulch that feeds the soil and shades it cool. Their manure seeds the ground with the very life that had been mined out of it. It is slow. It is also the only thing she had ever seen rebuild dead ground, because Emmett had shown it to her on 12 acres behind the old barn that Walt had given up on years before and let Emmett fool with. And those 12 acres were the greenest, springiest, most alive ground on the whole place. She had no cattle. She had no money to buy cattle. What she had was 1,400 acres of ground that could grow grass for free if she gave it the chance, and she had a phone, and she had the names of every cow-calf operator within 60 miles who was short on summer pasture in a dry year. This is the part Ostrander could not have modeled, because it was not in any budget he had ever seen. She did not need to own the cattle. She needed to rent her grass to someone else's cattle and charge by the head and the day. Custom grazing, the trade calls it. You take in another man's animals. You move them across your ground on a schedule that builds your soil instead of mining it. You send them home heavier in the fall, and you keep the money. The cattle do the work of healing the land, and the owner pays you for the privilege. To a cornman, it sounded like keeping someone else's hogs for free. To Romy, it was the lever, long enough to move $600,000. The first man who said yes was not a friend. He was a neighbor named Kurt Lindholm, and he said yes for the wrong reason, which was that he expected her to fail and wanted to be close enough to buy the ground cheap when she did. Lindholm farmed 3,000 acres on the other side of the river, all of it in corn and soybeans, all of it on equipment so new it still carried dealer film on the seats. He was the foil to everything Romy was, and the country around Stell admired him for it. He had a grain handling system that could load a semi in 4 minutes. He had a planter that drove itself by satellite. He had, that spring, 200 bred heifers he had bought on speculation, and nowhere cheap to summer them, and Romy offered him a rate per head per day that was lower than the sale barn lot and a handshake that said she would take good care of them. He took the deal. He told his wife that night that the Bauer girl would be broke by August, and he would own the river bottom by Christmas, and he believed it the way Ostrander believed the spreadsheet, sincerely and for good reasons that happened to be wrong. Which brings us to how she set up the ground, because the cleverness was all in the layout, and it cost almost nothing. She did not fence 1,400 acres into pastures. She bought a single spool of lightweight electric wire, a box of step-in posts, and a solar charger the size of a lunchbox. And with those, she could throw up a temporary fence across any piece of ground in 20 minutes and pull it the next morning. She watered the cattle off a length of black polypipe she rolled out behind the four-wheeler, with a portable trough she could drag from paddock to paddock. The whole infrastructure of her operation fit in the bed of a pickup. Ostrander, had he driven out to look, which he did not that first summer, would have seen 200 heifers in a small paddock of tall grass, and concluded she was overgrazing them into the ground. He would have been looking at the one day they were there. He would not have seen that they would be a quarter mile away the next morning, and that the grass behind them would not feel a hoof again for 2 months, and would come back from that single hard bite taller and thicker than before. The heifers moved every day, sometimes twice. Romy moved them herself at dawn, and again in the evening heat, walking the wire, reading the grass ahead of them, deciding by eye how big to cut the next strip so they ate the good and trampled the rest, and left nothing standing dead. The move itself was almost nothing to watch. She would open a gap in the wire onto a fresh strip of tall grass, and the cattle who had learned the rhythm in a week would already be standing at the line waiting, and they would walk through into the new feed without a single animal having to be pushed. She would pull the back fence behind them, roll up the wire onto its spool, drag the trough forward on its length of black pipe, and the whole township changing operation would be done in the time it took most men to fuel a tractor. The grass they left behind, chewed and trampled and dunged in a single hard day, would not see a hoof again until it had grown back over her knee. She kept a notebook of how many head days each paddock gave her and watched the number climb through the season as the ground woke up. By the middle of that first July, the 12 acres behind the old barn, the only ground that had been grazed this way for years, carried twice the grass of her best river bottom, and she could stand in it and feel the difference through her boots, the way it gave like a mattress instead of ringing like a floor. That, she knew, was where all 1,400 acres were headed, if she could only buy the years. The number that summer was small, and it was real. 200 head at $1.25 a day for 140 days came to $35,000, and she had spent under $4,000 to make it, most of that on wire and water lines she would never have to buy again. It did not touch the principal. It's not meant to. It paid the interest. It paid Emmett a wage for the first time in 2 years, and it proved a thing on paper that no projection could have proved in advance. The grass had paid. The ground that the cooperative had written down to scrap value had thrown off a margin that would have made any corn acre in the township jealous, and it had done it while getting healthier instead of poorer. She drove the deposit to the cooperative in person and laid it on the counter, and she asked the teller to make sure Mr. Ostrander saw the deposit slip. It was the closest thing to a message she sent him all year. Ostrander saw it. He filed it under anomaly. I am not mocking him when I say that. An anomaly is exactly what one good quarter looks like from inside a spreadsheet, and a careful lender does not rewrite a risk rating off a single deposit. He did the responsible thing by the only lights he had. He ordered a fresh appraisal of the collateral, because if the borrower was going to keep the ground, the institution needed to know what the ground was worth in a forced sale. The appraiser drove out in October, walked exactly 1 field near the road, photographed the cracked river bottom and the thin upland, noted the absence of a single growing crop, and valued the 1,400 acres at $410,000, underwater by nearly $200,000 against the note. Ostrander read the appraisal and felt the old certainty settle back over him like a coat. The arithmetic was clean again. He began quietly and without malice to prepare the ground for a workout, which is the polite institutional word for taking a farm away from someone in an orderly fashion. This is the part of the story where a careful man becomes an active one, and it matters that he did, because a defeat that comes from an opponent who never tried is no defeat at all. Ostrander did not sit and wait for Romy to miss a payment. He moved the note into the cooperative's special assets group, the team that handles loans the institution has decided to exit. He had the loan reclassified, which tripped the higher interest rate written into the note, raising her quarterly burden by almost $9,000 at a stroke. He sent her a certified letter requiring updated financials within 30 days and a credible written plan to bring the loan-to-value back into line, language that everyone in agricultural credit understands to mean produce a buyer. Or we will... And then he did the thing that was meant to end it. He drove across the river to Kurt Lindholm's place, sat in Lindholm's spotless kitchen, and let it be known, in the careful way such things are let be known, that the river-bottom ground might come available at a workout price before spring to a qualified buyer with the balance sheet to close fast. He did not say her name. He did not have to. He was offering the foil, the thing the foil had wanted from the start, and he was doing it because he sincerely believed he was rescuing good ground from a girl in over her head. Lindholm should have been delighted. Instead, he sat in his own kitchen after Ostrander left and felt something he could not name. And the thing he could not name was that he had spent a summer watching his 200 heifers come home in November, fat as ticks off ground he had written off as junk, and they had cost him less to summer than any pasture he had ever rented. And he had gone out one September evening to look at them, and found himself standing in grass to his knees on the worst river bottom in the township. Grass he could not have grown with all his equipment and all his fertilizer. And he had not slept well that night for reasons he refused to examine. He told Ostrander he would think about it. He did not call. Back the next day or the next week, and Ostrander, reading the silence as ordinary deal-making caution, felt no alarm. The foil's slow turn had begun, and it had begun where the niche says these things always begin, in a number. A man trusted more than his own opinion. The weight gain on 200 head he had expected to lose money on. Let me tell you about the winter. Because the winter was the black moment, and it nearly worked. The certified letter raised Romy's quarterly payment past what one summer of grass could carry. The fresh appraisal made it impossible to refinance the note anywhere else, because no other lender will write a loan against ground appraised at 2/3 of the debt. The special assets classification meant the cooperative was no longer her partner in any sense, but the collecting one. She sat at her father's kitchen table in December with the notebook of head days and the certified letter side by side, and the arithmetic that had felt like a lever all summer felt, for about 3 days, like a wall. She had proven the grass would pay. She had not proven it would pay fast enough to beat a man who had just moved the finish line $9,000 closer. Junie, her younger sister, found her there the third night, and did not offer comfort, because comfort was not what the family traded in. Junie was 19, and sharp with figures home from the community college in town for the winter, and she pulled out the chair across the table and put the certified letter face down so she would not have to look at it, and she took the notebook of head days instead. She read it the way Romy had taught her to read anything that asked for a signature, slowly, line by line, a pencil moving down the column of days and dollars. She found the thing Romy had been too tired and too frightened to see. Romy had been pricing her grass like a desperate woman. She had set her custom grazing rate below the sale barn to land the first contracts, and the ground had proven itself, and there was no longer any reason on earth to keep selling it cheap. Word had gotten around. 3 operators who had pasture wash out in the wet spring had already called asking whether the Bauer girl would take their cattle next summer. Demand had outrun supply, and the only person who had not raised the price was Romy. They sat up past midnight and rebuilt the projection at a rate 20% higher with more head on the same ground, because the grass was carrying more every year and stretched across the second summer. It came within $4,000 of the new quarterly burden. $4,000 was a wall you could climb. The next morning, Romy called every operator on the list and booked the second summer solid by the end of the week at the new rate, with deposits down. The wall came apart into arithmetic, and arithmetic she could do. Spring of the second year came on wet, and the wet was the structural shock, though it did not announce itself as one. It rained 11 inches in the first 3 weeks of May, and across the township the corn went in late and drowned in the low spots and had to be replanted twice on the heavy ground. Lindholm replanted 400 acres of river-bottom corn at a cost of better than $100 an acre, and watched half of it yellow and stunt in waterlogged ground that could not breathe. His expensive planter could not plant water. His satellite guidance could not drain a field. The very ground he had been planning to buy cheap from the cooperative, the river-bottom Romy's grass had been healing for a year, drank that 11 inches and held it like a savings account, because a soil with its living structure rebuilt can take in an inch of rain in minutes where her father's cement had taken an hour. While Lindholm's corn drowned, Romy's grass exploded. She took in 340 head. That second summer, 140 more than the first, on the same 1,400 acres, because the ground was carrying half again the forage it had a year before, and every animal of those 340 was paying her 20% more per day than the year before had. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge, and the niche earns its keep in moments like this one. There is a kind of knowing that is wide and shallow and confident that reads the county from a windshield and the farm from a spreadsheet and the season from a commodity report, and it is genuinely useful most of the time. And it is the knowing that built Lindholm's 3,000 acres and Ostrander's career, and there is a kind of knowing that is narrow and deep and patient, that lives in one piece of ground long enough to feel it change under a boot, that knows by eye how many days of grazing stand in a paddock, and by the give of the soil whether it is healing or dying. And it is slower to pay, and harder to explain, and it almost never wins the argument in the room. The wet spring did not reward the confident knowing. It rewarded the patient one. Not because the universe loves the patient, but because a soil rebuilt to drink rain is simply a better machine for a wet ear than a soil compacted to shed it. And 11 inches of rain in May does not care which knowing you believe in. It only finds out which one is true. Lindholm found out in June. He drove down to the river one evening to look at his drowned corn, and he stopped his truck at the fence line between his ground and hers, and he stood a long time looking across the wire. On his side, replanted corn struggling in standing water, the rows broken, the low ground bare and shining. On her side, grass to the belly of 300 head of someone else's cattle, the river bottom green and firm and breathing the same dirt, the same rain, the same sky. He had a degree in agronomy. He had spent $200,000 on equipment in the last 3 years. And he could not, standing at that fence, have grown what she had grown if his life depended on it, and he knew it. He drove home, and he did not call Ostrander about buying the river bottom. He called Romy instead, and he asked her, in a voice that cost him something, whether she would teach him to do what she had done on the 400 acres of his own ground that drowned every wet year. He offered to pay her. She told him she did not want his money. She wanted his fences moved and his cattle managed her way, and she wanted him to send his hired men over to learn the grass alongside Emmett, and that was how the neighbors first came to work for her, not as a conquest, but as students of a thing they had watched outperform everything they owned. Ostrander did not learn any of this until the second summer was nearly over. He learned it the way careful men learn the things their spreadsheets miss, all at once and too late to have caught it sooner. He drove out to the place in late August, finally, to assess the collateral he had been preparing to seize, and he got out of his clean sedan at the gate in his clean shoes, and stood in a wind that carried the smell of living ground, and what he saw did not fit anything in the file. He saw 340 head of cattle that were not hers grazing grass taller than his car door. He saw a temporary fence rolled across ground the appraisal had valued at scrap, and behind it a quarter-mile of rested pasture, so thick it lay over in the wind like a wheat field. He saw 2 of Kurt Lindholm's hired men he recognized, walking a wire and setting posts under the direction of a 24-year-old woman with a notebook in her hip pocket. He had come to confirm a liquidation. He was standing in the middle of an operation, and the operation was healthier than anything he financed for 40 miles in any direction. He found Romy at the waterline, rolling up Polly Pipe, and he did the thing that was hardest for a man of his certainty to do, which was ask a question he did not know the answer to. He asked her how many head she was running and what they were paying. She told him 340 head at $1.50 a day for 150 days. He stood there in the wind and did the arithmetic. He had spent 2 years certain could not be done, and it came to a number, and the number landed on him with a weight all out of proportion to its size, because it was not the size that mattered. It was that it existed at all on ground. His own institution had appraised as a loss $76,000 off a single summer off grass. Off ground he had written down to 410. And it was climbing every year as the soil rebuilt, while his confident corn ground around the township had just turned in its worst wet year harvest in a decade. He did not say much. There was not much for a careful man to say in the face of a number that unmade his model in front of him. He asked after a while whether he might walk the river bottom, and she said he could walk all of it he liked, and he did. In his ruined shoes and somewhere out in the deep grass on the ground, his appraiser had photographed cracked and dead a year before, Gil Ostrander stopped being a man who knew farms from a spreadsheet, slowly, and against the grain of 26 years, to become a student of one. Which brings us back to the note, because the arithmetic is the verdict, and the country around Stella pays its debts in arithmetic. Romy did not make the balloon payment. She never claimed she would. What she did was something the cooperative had stopped believing was possible from her, which was demonstrate a clean, growing, bankable cash flow off the collateral, and a cash flow is the only thing a lender truly lends against, no matter what the appraisal says. $76,000 the second summer, with contracts in hand for more the third, off an operation that cost almost nothing to run and improved its own collateral every season. Ostrander took that arithmetic back to the Special Assets Committee that had reclassified her as a loss, and he did the thing that cost a careful man the most, which was tell the people he answered to that the model had been wrong, that he had been wrong, that the ground was not a corpse and the borrower was not a girl in over her head, and that the responsible thing, the genuinely responsible thing, was to take her off the workout list and rewrite the note on terms a growing operation could carry. He fought for it. The committee did not want to hear it because committees trust appraisals over deposit slips, and he argued them down with her own notebook of head days laid open on the table. And he won, because the arithmetic was on his side now, and he had spent his whole career learning to follow arithmetic wherever it led, even when it led him here. The note was rewritten that fall. The balloon was gone, replaced by a longer amortization. The grass could service with room to spare, the punitive rate rolled back, the special assets classification removed. She still owed near $600,000. She would owe on it for years. Now, it was no longer a noose. It was a mortgage, the ordinary debt of an ordinary growing concern, and the difference between those two things is the difference between drowning and swimming in deep water. She had not paid off the farm. She had done something the niche values more, which was prove the farm could pay for itself on its own terms, against the confident certainty of everyone who measured it by the wrong number. By the third spring, the thing had a shape no one in Stell had a name for. 4 operators ran cattle on her ground now, and she had begun taking in stock cattle of her own, with the margin from the custom grazing, and she had started cleaning and selling seed from the deep-rooted native grasses she had nursed back on the river bottom. Because other farmers up and down the river had begun to want what she had and were willing to pay for the seed, and the knowing both. Kurt Lindholm had converted 600 of his 3,000 acres to managed grazing, and his hired men split their weeks between his ground and hers, learning the grass, and on her ground they answered to her. That is the literal truth the title points at the neighbors working for her, and it was not a conquest, and it was not revenge. It was that she had built the one operation in the township that was growing while the confident ones contracted. And good men go to work where the work is good. And the work was good on the Bower place because the ground was alive again and getting more alive every year. Emmett Roush lived to see it, which mattered more to Romy than the note. He was past 70 by the third summer, and his knees had quit him for good, and he rode the four-wheeler now instead of walking the wire, but he rode it out every morning to read the grass with her. The two of them stopped at a fence line at dawn, arguing in the comfortable way of people who agree about everything that counts. He had given her the only thing Walt had not, which was the eye for grass, the patient, narrow, deep knowing that had been worth nothing on a yield map and worth a farm in the end. She told him once at one of those fence lines that he had taught her the whole of it, and he told her that was not so, that he had only taught her the grass, and that she had taught herself the harder thing, which was to trust the grass against a room full of men who were sure she was wrong. She did not answer that. There was not anything to add to it. I will tell you about the last conversation between Romy and Gil Ostrander, because it is the one the whole story was walking toward, and it was quieter than you would expect. He came out to the place the third fall, not on cooperative business on his own time, and he asked her, plainly, the way a student asks how a soil could be taught to drink 11 inches of rain when his own ground shed it. She did not give him a speech. She walked him out to the river bottom and pressed the old cut-open coffee can an inch into the ground and poured a jug of water into it, and they stood and watched it vanish into the earth, in under a minute, into the same ground that had held water on its surface for over an hour 2 years before. That is 3 years of grass and cattle and rest, and there is no faster way, and there is no bag you can buy that does it. He looked at the can a long time. He had spent his life lending money, against the thing in a bag and against the yield it bought, and he had never once thought to time how long a piece of ground took to drink. He told her before he left that he had been wrong in a way he was not sure how to carry, and she told him he had not been wrong about the arithmetic, only about which arithmetic mattered, and that he had been the first man at the cooperative to follow the right one once he saw it, and that counted for more than being right from the start. It was as close to grace as the country around Stell ever offered anyone, and he took it, and he drove home a changed man, and the change held. Let me tell you the thing this story is actually about, now that the events are laid out and there is no risk of mistaking the lesson for a slogan. There are 2 kinds of knowing, and a culture that measures only what is easy to count will reward the wrong one almost every time, right up until the year it doesn't. The wide confident, knowing that, reads a farm from a windshield is not stupid, and the men who carry it are not bad men. Walt was not a bad man. Ostrander was not a bad man. They were sincere men running a sincere system that mistook the measurable for the valuable, that counted bushels and could not count whether the ground beneath the bushels was alive or dying, and the bill for that blindness comes due slowly and then all at once, in a wet May or a dry August, or a heart that stops in a tractor cab with the seed bill unpaid. The narrow patient, knowing that, lives in one piece of ground long enough to feel it change, does not win the meeting, and does not look like much from the road. And it is, at the time horizon, that actually matters, simply more true, because the ground does not lie, and the rain does not negotiate, and a soil rebuilt to drink will outlast every confident model that ever wrote it off. Romy Bauer never said any of that out loud. She was not a woman who made speeches, and she would have been embarrassed to hear her work turned into a thesis. She paid down a little principal every year and took in a few more cattle and cleaned a little more seed and taught a few more neighbors the grass, and she let the ground make the argument because the ground made it better than words ever could. The river bottom her father had farmed to cement and the cooperative had appraised to scrap carried more life by the fourth year than it had carried in 50, and you could stand in it and feel the give of it through your boots. And that was the whole of the answer to the man who had called her young lady across a desk and offered to take it off her hands clean. The last thing I will leave you with is small, the way the true things in this country are usually small. On a morning the fourth fall, before the cattle were moved, Romy walked out alone to the 12 acres behind the old barn. The ground Emmett had grazed his way for years, while Walt called it a waste, the ground that had shown her everything before she had a word for any of it. The grass stood deep and silver with dew and lay over in the early wind, and she pressed the old coffee can into the earth one more time, out of habit more than need, and poured the water and watched it disappear, and stood there in the quiet with her boots in ground that had never once stopped being alive, listening to nothing but the wind and grass. Her father never learned to read on 1,400 acres that were hers, that had always, in the only way that counted, been worth more than the number anyone tried to put on them.